In this lecture, we are going to implement login functionality in our Angular application without using NgRx. For that, let's go to VS Code, and here what I'm going to do is inside this auth folder, I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it as services, and inside this services folder, I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call it as auth.service.ts. Inside this, we are going to create a service class. So here I'm going to create a class. I'll call it as auth service, and I'm also going to export this class so that we can use this service class outside of this file. And we are going to decorate this class with @injectable decorator. Okay, and to use this @injectable decorator, we also need to import it from angular/co. To this, we are going to pass an object, and there we are going to use this provided in property, and we are going to provide this service from root. All right, let me save the changes. Now, from within this auth service, we are going to make an HTTP call. And in Angular, whenever we want to make an HTTP request, whether it's a GET request, POST request, PUT request, or DELETE request, we need to use HTTP client module in our Angular application. So since I'm providing this service from root, what we are going to do is we are going to import HTTP client module in the app module file, because this app module is our root module. And since we are providing our service from root, we are going to import the HTTP client module inside this app module. So here, let me go ahead and let me add HTTP client module. And to use this HTTP client module, we are also going to import it from @angular/common/HTTP. Okay, let's save the changes. Now we are going to inject an instance of HTTP client inside this auth service. For that, let's go ahead and let's create a constructor. And inside this constructor, we are going to specify a private property. Let's simply call it as HTTP, and it is going to be of type HTTP client. And to use this HTTP client, we need to import it from angular/common/HTTP. So in this way, we will have an instance of HTTP client injected in this auth service, and it will be assigned to this HTTP property. Now here, I'm going to create a login method, and we are going to call this login method from login component. So currently in the login component, whenever the login button is clicked, we are simply logging the form value. But instead of logging the form value, what we are going to do is we are going to call the login method of this auth service. So in this auth service, we are creating this login method. This is going to receive two parameter, email of type string and password of type string. All right. Now here, in order to log in the user, we are going to make a post request. So here I can say this.http. This HTTP is storing an instance of HTTP client, and on that we have a method called post in order to make a post request to the backend API. So here I'm going to use this post method. Now this post method takes two parameters. It takes the URL to which we want to make the post request, and with that post request, we might also want to send some request body. So as the second argument, we need to pass the request body. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a URL variable, and in order to make a login request, if I go to the documentation, here you see in order to log in a user, in order to sign in a user to Firebase, we need to make a post request. And where do we need to make this post request? We need to make this post request to this URL. So I'm going to copy this URL and I'm going to paste it here. Now in here, we need to replace this API key with the API key of our Firebase project. And in the last lecture, I copied that API key in this notepad. So from here, I'm going to copy it. Let's go back to our application. And what I'm going to do is, if I scroll down, we should also have a constants folder, constants file. in here, I'm going to create another constant and export it. And I'm going to call it as Firebase underscore API underscore key. And to this, I'm going to assign that API key. Let's save this file and let's close this. And we are calling it as Firebase API key. So let me close this. And here, I'm going to, here let me actually use template literal syntax. So here I'm going to use backticks instead of single quote. And I'm using backticks because here I want to use template literal syntax. And in there, I'm going to specify Firebase API key constant. So first we need to import it from constant.ts file and then we are specifying it. So this is the URL to which we want to make the post request. In the URL, we are specifying the API key of our project. Now let's also create another constant and I'm going to call it as body. And this body is basically going to be an object where I want to have an email field, and this email I'll assign with this email. And since the property name and the parameter which we want to assign to it, it is same, I don't need to explicitly assign it. I can simply say email, and this email will be assigned with the value stored in this email parameter. And in the same way, we also need to pass the password. Okay. And again, since the name is same, we don't need to explicitly assign it with the value stored in this password parameter. And now let's pass this URL as the first argument to this post method, and let's pass this body as the second argument of this post method. And this post method here, it is going to return us an observable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to return that same observable from within this login method. Let's save the changes. And now let's go to LoginComponent.ts. And from here, we are going to call the login method of auth service. So maybe I'll comment this console.log statement for now. Now, in order to call the login method of auth service, first we need to inject an instance of auth service inside this login component. So here I'm again going to specify a constructor, and inside that constructor, let's go ahead and let's create a private property. Let's call it auth service, and this is going to be of type auth service. And to use this auth service, we also need to import it. So now inside this auth service, we will have an instance of auth service injected. We are going to use that auth service property inside this on login. So here we will say this dot auth service dot, and here we are going to call the login method of auth service. Now when we are calling this login method, we need to pass the value for email and password parameter. So we are going to read the email and password parameter from login form.value. So here what I'll do is I'll create two variables, and here I'm using object destructuring syntax where I'm going to specify an email variable and a password variable. And to this, I'm going to assign this dot login form.value. Now remember, this login form has two fields, email and password. So in this value property, which is going to be an object, we will have an email property and password property. So the value of email property we want to assign to this email variable, and the value of password property we want to assign to this password variable. So here I'm using object destructuring syntax. Now let's go ahead and let's pass this email to this login method, and let's also pass this password as the second argument to this login method. And as we learned, this login method of auth service, it is going to return us an observable. So here, let's go ahead and let's subscribe to that observable. And when the login is successful, to this subscribe method, we are passing a callback function. This callback function is going to receive the response data. So here, let me simply call it as response. And what we will do is, for now, let's simply go ahead and let's log that response. So let's say console.log, and here we want to log the response. Let's save the changes. Now let's quickly test if the login functionality is working or not. So remember, if the login is successful, you see, okay, apart from email and password, we also need to specify this return secure token in the request body. So I forgot to add that. Let's quickly add it here in this body object. So here I'm going to specify another property, return secure token, and in case of login it should always be true, because here when the login is successful we want Firebase to return us the secure token which will later be used for providing access to the protected resources. Okay, so this is going to be the request body. In the request body we need to pass email, password and return secure key, as you can see. And in the response, if the login is successful, in the response we are going to receive an object, and in that object we are going to have these properties. Now in the last lecture we created one user, this test@gmail user. So let's try to log in this user. Let's go to our Angular application. There let me go to login page, and here let's specify the email, test@gmail.com, and here let's specify the password for that email, and that is test1234. And before I click on the login button, let me open developer console. Let me clear everything here, and when I click on this login button, you will see that an object has been logged here, and this object has properties like display name, email, expires in, ID token, kind, local ID, refresh token, etc. So you see here we are receiving an object in the response, and this simply means that the user was successfully logged in, and that's why in the response we have received the details of that user. If I scroll down, here we have the refresh token, here we have the ID token. So this ID token will be used for providing the user access to the protected routes. Then we can also see the email of the logged in user. We also see the expires in, which tells after how much time this token will expire. In this case it is 3600. Okay, then we can see the local ID. This local ID is basically the user ID of the user who has logged in. So here we are successfully able to call the login API, and the user is successfully logged in. Now what I want is, let's go back to VS Code. So here we know that this post method, it is going to return us an object with some logged in user data. And what data we are going to have? We are going to have the ID token of the user, the logged in user, the email of the logged in user, refresh token of the logged in user, expires in, local ID and registered. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new model. So for that, in the models folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it as user.model.ts. In here, I'm going to create and export an interface, and I'm going to call it as user. So here what properties we need to specify? We need to specify ID token, email, refresh token. So let's go ahead and let's add that. ID token of type string, email of type string, refresh token of type string. Then what else we have? We have expires in, local ID and registered. And this registered is of type boolean. All other properties are string. So we need to add expires in, local ID and registered. Let's go ahead and let's do that. This expires in, this is also going to be of type string. Then we have local ID, which is going to store the user ID of the logged in user. This is also of type string. And then we have this property registered. So if the user is already present in the user table, then this registered will be true. So it is going to store a boolean value. Now here I'm going to make this registered as optional, because during the sign in process, in the sign in response, we will get this registered along with all other properties. But for the sign up, when we are creating a new user, at that time we are basically registering that user. So during the sign up response, we will not have this registered property. We will have all other properties, but we will not have registered when we are making a sign up request. So that's why I'm making it as optional, so that during the sign up also we can use this same user interface as the type. Let's save the changes here. And now all I'm going to do is here I'm going to specify that this post method, it is going to return us a response of type user. And to use this user, we also need to import it. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to our application and let's test the sign up one more time. So let me refresh the page. And here again, let's pass test@gmail.com. And the password here is test1234. If I click on this login button, you see the login was successful, and in the response we have received an object of type user. Now here if you see in this response, we have some extra properties which is not specified in this response type. Basically, we also have this display name and we also have this kind. But we are not going to use these two properties in our application. So it's okay to not include it in this user model. Now currently what we are doing is in the login component, when we have the logged in user data, we are simply logging it. But instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is here I'm going to create a new property called logged in user, which is going to be of type user. And to use this user, we also need to import it. Okay. And here what I'm going to do is here I'll simply say this dot logged in user equals this response data. Okay. Now, if in the login component we want to use this logged in user detail, we can use that. But once the user is logged in, usually we redirect the user to the home page. And once the user is logged in, we might want to display the logged in user data in the header component and in other components. So instead of creating a state, a property like logged in user inside this login component, what we are going to do is we are going to create a state for this auth module. And in that state, we will have a user state which will store the logged in user data. And that we will do in our next lecture. So in the next lecture, what I'll do is I will remove this property and instead I'll create a state for storing the logged in user data. And from here, instead of calling this login method of auth service directly, we are going to dispatch an action. And when that action is dispatched, it should be handled by NgRx effect. So in our coming lectures, we will understand what is NgRx effect and why we should use NgRx effect in our NgRx application. But this is all I wanted to cover in this lecture. In the next lecture, let's go ahead and let's modify this code. So we are going to create a new state, some actions, and also some reducers. And then after that, we will understand what is an NgRx effect, and we will also create an NgRx effect in our coming lectures.